Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome in to another podcast by George. Well, it's that time of year. May 4th is a very special day for me because I've got a very near and dear relative. It's their birthday on May 4th, but it's also an historic date in American history, really. And it has a lot to do with my coming of age and the Vietnam War and that era. And I'm reminded of it constantly every day when I turn on cable television and I see John Brennan and Jim Clapper and people like that on cable TV. Honest to God, I think, have we not learned anything? And have we forgotten our past? And this is a key part of it, folks. This is one of these Rosetta Stones that you hear me talk about all the time on Podcast by George. And that's who our guest is going to be today, talking about Kent State. Our guest is Laurel Krause. It was her sister, Allison Krause, a 19-year-old honors student that was killed by U.S. government forces at Kent State University as she protested the Vietnam War on May 4th, 1970. 3 other students and protesters died that day: Sandra Lee Schur, William Knox Schroeder, and Jeffrey Glenn Miller. And Jeffrey was that kid that was on the ground when that historic Pulitzer Prize winning photo was taken with a 14-year-old girl over his body that is seared in everyone's memory. And we're going to get to all of that. So let's welcome in our guest, Laurel Krause. Welcome to a podcast by George.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so, it seems like some people have forgotten. Normally, I would say we don't need to revisit this. We can talk about today, but we do need to revisit it to a certain extent. Laurel, how do you kind of summarize for people what happened on that tragic day in 1970?
On May 4th, 1970, the United States government wanted to quell protest. The students on campuses across the country were protesting President Nixon's announcement of the Cambodian invasion he made on April 30th. The days ratcheted up across campuses across the country. Lots of young people were protesting. A lot of anti-war protesters were protesting. A lot of older people who were against war were protesting. It was in the streets, and the U.S. government they caused this situation, and they ended up taking action. And the action that they chose to take was to go to Kent State University and turn it into an occupied state over that weekend. It was Thursday on April 30th. And then as the days ratcheted up on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, it became a war zone at the university. And it culminated on the 4th at a noon rally at noontime on campus. Students were changing classes. The military was out there too with M1s and riot and actual war gear. They had tear gas, they had all their regalia on, they had M1 rifles, which can shoot 5 miles with a bullet. And they came on the campus, on the commons. They canceled the protest that the students had organized for noon, and they moved them on campus. The students were totally unarmed, and they herded them up to the highest point on the land. The students thought things were over pretty much because the guard were just kind of standing around. Then they went back up to the top of the hill. They all turned in unison, and they all shot in unison, and they killed 4 and wounded 9 students and protesters.
Well, let me interrupt you there just briefly, because that's a couple of things that are seared in my mind again that I always remind people of. They shot boys and girls. They shot them down like they were dogs. And that circumstance that you're citing about them turning and firing in unison, that kind of dispels the myth that was promulgated at that time, which I still remember that it was just chaos, that it was just indiscriminate firing and some students just happened to get hit. That doesn't sound like what you're describing at all. That clearly was not the case.
Beyond that, the government said that the National Guard who were there in their war regalia with M1s were in fear for their lives from the students. And this is the first time we ever heard that. But it's been used time and time again for, police shootings,
Yes.
etc. And I mean, you have to take a look at this the way it is in reality. Men who are trained at war are there on campus with M1s, and they're in fear from their lives from students unarmed that were not anywhere nearby. The photographs show, I mean, my sister, Allison, she was 343 feet from her shooters. That's more than a football field away. And she was like one of the most active protesters there that day. She was in the front areas and front ranks. And for her to be 300 feet away, more than 300 feet away, how is that, creating a situation where these guys are in fear for their lives? Is what we've always wanted. And beyond that, the Guard all turned in unison and shot in unison. And the thing that came out when my family started investigating this, my father, Arthur Krause, and mother, Doris Krause, they took this to the courts immediately. There was no order to fire. That's what was claimed by the Guard. But there's no sense in that. There's no logic involved in that excuse. How does a troop of men with their guns all turn in unison and shoot in unison without an order? We fast forward 40 years after the Kent State massacre, the order to fire came out. And it was exposed by a top flight forensic expert who does forensics. He was doing forensics at Watergate, okay? And he's independent, so, the government doesn't like that. And he went and he isolated an order to fire and found a lot more along with it, with government involvement in creating the massacre at Kent State.
Well, as I mentioned, that was coming of age for me. Laurel and I are about the same age. I was 14, turning 15 years old. I was watching the evening
So
news.
You were born in 1955?
Yes.
Me too.
Yeah. And I was watching the evening news with my parents, and like a lot of people, young people, I was influenced by my parents, but we were watching the casualty counts come in, because that was a big part of the news broadcasts. Every night
Yes.
they would talk about the Vietnam War, and 5 American soldiers would be killed and 500 Vietnamese would be killed. And we thought, well, this every night like this doesn't seem right. I think they're lying to us. And then Nixon expanded that war into Cambodia, and it had been going on for some time, and we knew that was a lie. And then they gunned down these kids on the campus of Kent State, and for my family, that was the awakening. I mean, we looked at it and said, oh my God, and we can't be a part of this. I was planning on, if the war continued, I was going to go to Canada. I was going to escape this. I knew that we were being lied to. I knew that we were being shot down in the street. And then that iconic, that wonderful song by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Ohio, came out. And really, for me, Laurel, I got to tell you, there was news coverage of this, of course, but we were here in the heartland. A lot of my understanding, a lot of my awareness of the incident on the Kent State campus was because of that song.
It came out, it wasn't played in Vietnam. It wasn't played on regular AM radio at the very beginning. It was that song told too much truth about what happened at Kent State. But one of the part that I really want to interject for young people especially is your concern about the Vietnam War was personal. Yes. You were looking at a couple of years of having to go and fight in that war. And no one wanted to fight in that war except the Department of Defense. and the students and the young people were flat out against the war. We were against the war, fully against the war. But because the laws at that time did not allow for people that were under 21 to vote. It really was a tinderbox for us because we have to go fight a war, but we can't vote. Was an outrage.
Yeah,
and everyone that was your age was looking at it. Okay, I'm going to have to face this, and I don't want to go.
We couldn't buy a beer, couldn't go to a bar legally, but they were going to pack us off to Vietnam to fight in this unjust war that we understood. Well, the horror is just all too real, and it's tragic and a part of your everyday life, obviously. But the thing about it is, Laurel, that I wanted you to talk about was what's transpired since then. Again, this is historic as far as what the American government did to your sister and those three other. And we should mention the people that were wounded. There's a guy that is paralyzed for life, I think, that was shot down on the campus of Kent State. And then Jackson State shootings, too. Just mention that briefly. I mean, this was worse than just 4 dead in Ohio.
Well, there were 9 wounded, ranging anywhere at Kent State, anywhere from paralyzation to having your heel shot off. So you're going to walk different the rest of your life. Some people had minor, but most people have major. And by the way, when the government shoots you, no one pays your health bill. There's no insurance.
Yeah.
So Dean Kaler, who is in a wheelchair, we had to settle our lawsuit so that he could have medical care, so that he could have enough to live on for the rest of their lives. And they did that on purpose. They gave us just enough, basically lawsuits started immediately after this. And the lawsuits, the history of Kent State is that it's censored, that no one's allowed to talk about it, that no one's allowed to know what really happened. But I still really want to know, what were they doing on their side? All the investigations have been about the students. The students were just targets. They weren't doing anything except changing classes and protesting the war. But the others that were there, and I got to tell you, they had everybody there. This was COINTELPRO. This is counterintelligence programs. This is a covert army of the FBI was in charge of what happened at Kent State on May 4, 1970, and the days leading up. Basically, they came in, they had Ohio National Guard, obviously. They had Highway Patrol. They had Kent City Police. They had Kent Campus Police. They had Army Intelligence. They had every kind of intelligence group that you could imagine was there. And what they were doing? They were encouraging this event. They were precipitating this event. They weren't quieting it down and saying, oh no, we have to calm this down and bad things will happen if we don't. No, they were raising the fury of the times. They were making sure that they had targets on May 4 to shoot at, to make their point, to let those young people know, and the anti-war protesters know, if you dare to protest against war, you're taking your life in your hands. And that is what happened at Kent State.
That's right. They shot and killed protesters on their own campus, for God's sake. National Guard people that were there primarily, as I understood it, to protect property. And if anybody thinks that Laurel isn't right, remember that Richard Nixon, the president of the United States, came out and called these people bums, for God's sake. If you think that that wasn't what was happening, think about what that was said afterwards, and it completely underlines and emphasizes exactly what she's talking about. Well, before we run out of time here, I not only wanted to dwell on the past, but I good on you, and I just wanted to tell everybody that Laurel has been carrying this flag for 50 years now, trying to get the truth to be told and trying to get the record to reflect what she's talking about. Laurel, you've had some successes. You've had some failures. I know you had some success at the UN, but it's an ongoing struggle. Tell us what's happening.
Well, we took it to the UN in 2014, and unbelievable. The Department of Justice representative admitted on March 14, 2014, that it was killing and murder at Kent State. Now they've admitted it finally, but will they do anything about it? That remains to be seen. Will they act, and basically the killing and homicide is the statute of limitations never expires for that. So the 4 that were killed at Kent State, it still needs to be addressed. And we were really happy to take it to the UN because we're outside the complete control of the United States when we're there. I still have a lot of control at the UN, what the US does, but at least we're in another body that the US has to answer to, at least in form. And so we're going back for the US 5th periodic review. And we'll be joining many other groups related to excessive force, violence, and deadly force used by police and the military against civilians and protesters. We're going to be joining, and it will be a very large group with Amnesty International and ACLU and everyone. And I hope that we can get under this big umbrella and demand that the United States answer to what they're trying to do to protesters in America today. Because this issue at Kent State affects today with relation to a government killing protesters. You're not allowed to do it, but when you do it, you have to have a higher level of investigation. You have to make amends. There's a whole procedure related at the UN and the treaty that we signed. The US government has done none of this, and it's time for them to do what they signed and to obey the treaty.
God, this has been great. It's a tragic circumstance. I just love having you on the show. It's great to have a kindred spirit. You would be, I mean, there aren't many of us left that have the depth of experience and knowledge that you do, Laurel, and because of your sister, obviously, and this special place in your heart. As we go out here, speaking to young people now, what would be your advice? I started off a little bit talking about the talking heads and the CIA and FBI that are controlling our news dialogue here in this country, and people need to be aware of that. They need to be skeptical, and they need to be discerning when it comes to their news sources. To me, that's right at the top of the list, but what would be your advice to the younger folks particularly?
Be very careful. These are times we're going into protest again. The pitchforks are coming out.
Yeah.
And like they came from my sister. Nothing has changed. There's no protection for protesters today. I worry. This keeps me up at night. So I think that young people, if they can start taking a look at their protest rights, as they protest and be very, very careful, I think that I'm worried. And I don't know, what the right words are, because I don't know how this is going to play out. But I do want people to start realizing, America was born on protest. It's what we're supposed to be able to do. It's drilled into our heads, when we're going to school, how we're allowed to protest, whatever. But that's not true. And so I don't know how we solve this, but I think awareness is a huge part of it.
Well, as we end here today, I want to talk, I want you to talk, actually. Tell us how people can contact you. I know you've got a great Facebook presence, and you're the admin of a couple of great organizations, and how people can become more aware and involved in this flag that you've been carrying for over 50 years now.
Well, I encourage everyone to take a look at www.truthtribunal.org. It's the Kent State Truth Tribunal website. I haven't talked much about that, but I will in another time. I hope to speak about that with you when we have more developments with our tribunal. But basically, I just refreshed the website for the 51st, and it tells my whole story, and it also has all the links backing where I'm coming from. So I encourage everyone to take a look. Please follow our progress. We're going to the UN whenever the US decides that they have to go. And I also live here at the Allison Center for Peace. It's a place where we get on with our peace in America, here on the west coast of Northern California on the Mendocino coast.
Ah, that's great. Folks, that's Laurel Krause, and I know she loves being identified this way. That's Allison Krause's younger sister, tragic victim from Kent State, as we pass here through the month of May and remember and never forgotten the victims of Kent State University. Folks, I hope you like Podcast by George. I hope you saw the web address for Laurel's website. Visit those and go to Podcast by George, podcastbygeorge.com, and pick a platform where you'd like to follow us, and you'll be notified of each and every new Podcast by George as it releases. But that's going to do it for now. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George.